So we have a very impressive panel, great wealth and depth of expertise spanning the globe, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations and the dialogue. So to kick us off, I turn over to Caitlin and Maria, who will be presenting jointly how, the title of your paper is The Gendered Politics of Natural Resource Management in Conflict Crises. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for those wonderful presentations. The paper that we're going to present today, it's very much work in progress. We're just beginning to work on this research project. So your comments, questions, suggestions are very, very much welcome. And the idea came that there's an emerging and paramount set of initiatives that link basically conflict prevention, natural resource management, and women's participation in resource management. So we can see that from USAID programs to World Bank programs, even the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda hosted side events on climate and security, a new era for women, peace and security, et cetera, et cetera. So these initiatives are framed for us around two core assumptions. The first assumption is that natural resource management provides a good opportunity to increase women's participation in fragile and conflict settings. And second, that women's participation in this natural resource management is necessary to prevent conflict in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And so what we are trying to do here is to study through one of these initiatives and programs, the so-called UN Joint Program on Women, Natural Resources and Peace. Caitlin, maybe, yeah, okay, good. What we're trying to do here is to basically study those assumptions. What are those assumptions doing? What the UN thinks it's doing in terms of the linkages between women, natural resources, and peace. So the joint program, we chose the joint program on women, natural resources, and peace because it is basically it is the main arena within the UN where this agenda of linking women, natural resources, and peace is emerging. And for the moment, there has been two pilot programs, one in Colombia and one in South Sudan, and we will talk a little bit about those, but it's been upscaled and there are two additional countries. The Peacebuilding Fund is also putting a lot of resources. And so the idea is that this joint program is getting bigger and bigger. So what we are proposing here is a deeper interrogation of what meanings gender equality and women's empowerment is assuming in this program, in these natural resource management initiatives, and with what consequences for the design of environmental peace building policies. So what are the effects actually of the joint program on the distribution of resources and power at different scales? And to do so, we're taking a critical feminist lens. So this means that we're not interested actually only in the interpersonal relations between men and women, boys and girls in natural resource management. We're not interested actually in evaluating the program. The UN is already doing that, or in establishing whether or not the program achieved its objectives on gender equality. Rather, what we are doing is trying to understand what happens when gender is understood as adding women, and what gender is and how it is that full participation of women in existing public and economic life is understood. So for us, what we're trying to understand is how gender relations structure relations between states, between international institutions and the markets, and between the international intervenants and the local population. So this will help us understand why and how international environmental security agendas privilege matters of or reinforce masculine ideas about security and about power, how international interventions have prioritized, for example, the construction of roads to the construction of hospitals and schools, and how in turn this makes people less secure in gender ways. So who gets a job versus who actually needs to stay at home and take care of the children, of the sick, of the elderly. And so this requires us to understand what policies and practices in terms of natural resource management become possible. What type of characteristics and are given to women? What type of jobs? What types of tasks are given to women in this agenda on natural resource management? And how the understanding of gender and of women is deployed to solve particular problems. And we think that to do this, we study three things. We study the discourses, so the rationalities that are produced to justify the linkages between gender and natural resource management, the material techniques and technologies, so the mechanisms through which the UN makes sure that these discourses are translated into policies, and finally, again, the subject positions or the identities, the characteristics that women and men are given or are supposed to have in post-conflict resource-dependent countries. And I'm gonna leave it a little bit. I'm gonna leave it to Caitlin to explain what are our first analysis and our first conclusions on this.
Okay, thanks very much, Maria. Okay, so one thing that we notice when we apply this kind of analytical lens to this agenda is reference to leveraging women. So we see this in different ways throughout the agenda and throughout reports on the different pilot projects. So I've just included a few examples here from how reference to leveraging women is used. So it's used in relation to leveraging the agency of women, leveraging women's unique knowledge in natural resource management. And then implicitly in the third example, there is the idea that women have unique knowledge that makes peace more equitable and more just in relation to natural resource management. So the broader argument that we would make, not just from the way that leveraging women appears, but the broader argument that we would make is that there is a focus on gender being a set of interpersonal relations primarily. And we think that while this is surely part of how gender functions, that this also misses some of the broader structural relations of power that go beyond the level of the interpersonal. So the joint program is then effectively absolving the state and the international community, and in particular, the role of the international economy from conflict prevention responsibility. So it's a program that seeks to explore how to use gender equality for natural resource management, and thus shifts responsibility for security and peace and economic well-being to women. Now, we don't want to say that it is inherently a problem to include women in natural resource management, but this is a question of how are women represented, and what kinds of material consequences does this have, and what are the silences around the way that they're represented, and particularly in relation to this notion of leveraging women. So we see a persistence of a dual portrayal of women as being vulnerable because of their socio-cultural background or their socio-economic position, and as being responsible agents for change, responsible agents for peace. And this is similar to what a lot of feminist scholars have pointed out about previous aspects of the women, peace, and security agenda, particularly in relation to how women are expected to be both vulnerable victims of sexual and gender-based violence, but also agents of change. So this persistence of a dual portrayal of women's vulnerability and women's agency in context of crisis means that the limitations that women face are face are predominantly framed in terms of their capacity. This is sometimes in terms of their socioeconomic capacity, but this is almost always limited to the local socioeconomic factors. And we think that this is a result of seeing gender as merely interpersonal, because then it allows us to see the fault for gendered oppressions and exclusions as being situated within a particular local configuration of gender relations, cultural, household divisions of labor, religion, or maybe at a stretch how these have been translated into state policies. So here we want to make it clear that we are not saying that gender as interpersonal relations is irrelevant, but rather we're claiming that understanding them is necessary but insufficient on their own. We're drawing a lot from the work of great Cynthia Enloe here, obviously. Okay, so what makes this narrative possible? Partly this is about how the joint program sees the inclusion of women in natural resource management and peace as a win-win scenario, right? That you manage to achieve gender equality and peace and good natural resource management. Women are empowered to participate, conflict is prevented, there's economic gain. It's also possible in part because it really privileges notions of natural resource management being matters of local security. But we think what this misses a bit is the materiality of what women are actually, what materiality is necessary for women to actually engage in more inclusive decision making. And it also reflects, as we say, an interpersonal, individualized conception of agency, not accounting for how women might act in interest with young men, or how women might act actually to exclude other women, for instance. And we think that this is the inevitable result of treating gender as a matter of interpersonal relations. So to give some examples from the specific projects of how we see this as a bit troubling is in the Sudan project, as well as in the UN Secretary General's report for 2020, there is repeated reference to leveraging women's knowledge and leveraging the opportunities that arise from men's outmigration that come about as a result of climate crisis. But we think this obscures all of the things that made these conditions possible, including the broader global causes of climate collapse, and including the historicization of seasonal outmigration in pastoralist communities. We also think this risks playing into the gendered and racialized tropes of violent, roving bands of men, which could be used to further discourses that climate catastrophe is driving outmigration to the global north. In the summary of the Colombian pilot, there's an absence of discussion of uneven land distribution as having a colonial legacy in Colombia, and that the current rising tensions and expulsions from land are not merely a matter of exploitative interpersonal gender relations, but have roots in transnational business. These relations can still be understood with a gender lens, but it requires thinking gender beyond the interpersonal. So I'm conscious that I'm probably going over my time here, and I want to make sure that we also talk about the silences. And then we think that one of the big silences is the role of extractive industries, and in particular, the link between militarization and extractive processes of minerals, right? In other words, militarization relies on the extraction of mineral resources, and in turn, that militarization fuels violent conflict. So the absence of these from discussions on gender and natural resource management obscure some of the greatest effects of climate catastrophe, and in turn, some of the greatest causes of insecurity for communities. So when extractive industries are included in the agenda, they're often only included as how to bring more women into the extractive industry or how to make the benefits of extractive industries more inclusive. But the underlying logic of extractivism and its link to militarization is not called into question. And this leaves the global essentially off the hook. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up because I've totally abused my time here. So the work that gender is doing, as I said, means that meaning is taken as gender as interpersonal relations that are contained within and limited to particular sociocultural contexts. And then it takes that as a way to have an opportunity to make peace better by including women in natural resource management. But this obscures the broader global gendered and racialized structures and relations that are creating some of these contexts to begin with. Okay, sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Maria. I think that is a great kickoff to the panel itself and the presentations and the discussions to ensue because of the kind of large epistemological questions that you raised that I think force us to maybe, trouble some of the categories that we used without thinking about too deeply sometimes. So I think it's a great kind of framing for opening the panel. So now over to Jessica, who will be speaking to key principles to the gender, climate, and security nexus.
Thank you very much. Yes, so my name is Jessica and I work with International Alert, which is an international peacebuilding organization. And yeah, kind of what we see in our work and the communities and the policy spaces that we work in is that kind of climate change adaptation, peace building, and gender policy and programming are currently not very well kind of synced nor integrated. And yeah, the reality is as well that climate and peace building finance also doesn't really provide that incentive to do so. And that's a real issue because the implications of missing that gender lens is that it leads to weaker solutions to climate change adaptation, and it also jeopardizes sustainable peace as an outcome of peace building interventions. And basically by excluding women, youth, people of different sexual orientations, minority groups, you really risk designing imperfect programs that by themselves then can become basically a source of new grievances. And yeah, the efforts of these programs in terms of maybe building social cohesion, building trust and cooperation will only really be partial if you don't apply a thorough gender lens as your perspectives and engagements of certain groups are ignored. And so as International Alert, in order to really further this discussion and make policymakers and practitioners understand what action can be taken and should be taken, we work with 3 of our country offices in Mali, Myanmar, and Lebanon to basically try and better understand the links between gender, climate change adaptation, and conflict, and how peace building, adaptation, and gender transformation goals can really go hand in hand in policies and programs. We kind of that research, we summarized the insights into a short guidance note that highlights 6 principles to integrate gender and peace building into climate change adaptation. And yeah, that paper will be accessible through the website. So what I want to do now is not to take you through those 6 principles one by one, because you can read them up yourself, but rather kind of summarize the main suggestions as part of a 2-step approach that is needed to work towards integrating programming on this nexus. And that it's not rocket science. First step is analysis, second step is programming, but I will take you through this. Talking about the first step of analysis, this is really about developing that very granular understanding of the context, which is really important, as we all recognize, to be serious about achieving gender as well as conflict sensitive climate adaptation in fragile states. And such analysis really needs to have kind of two components, I would say. So first of all, it's about developing that understanding of the kind of differentiated effects of conflict and climate change on women and men of different ages and social backgrounds. And key questions that we need to ask ourselves is like, whose voices are we missing? Who's traditionally not represented? And how can we engage them without interfering with their income generating activities or their unpaid care duty? And really the benefit of deliberately hearing and engaging these groups is that we won't fall trapped to an oversimplification of social dynamics in a society. So that's basically step one of that analysis, understanding the differentiated effects. The second step is really to look at the agency of women and men of different ages and social backgrounds. So how do they adapt to climate change effects? How do they respond to conflict risks? And this will prevent us from victimizing certain groups, and really encourage us to look at their capacities and their responses instead, and really basically consider them as full societal actors that bring solutions to the table, that bring lessons learned to the table. And we will find that people and groups have been adapting to climate change impacts, either in positive ways or negative ways, which sometimes been called maladaptation. And we need to learn from that. So yeah, that's really basically what this analysis part really needs to be part of. But once that analysis has managed to kind of unravel the different gender dimensions to climate change and conflict, the second step is to put gender transformation at the center of climate and peace building action and programming. And this needs to do three things basically. First of all, it's about recognizing the cultural and practical barriers to representation, including issues like education level of different groups, understanding household and community expectations of different groups, and how income and care demands really hamper engagement of some groups. So that's one, really recognize the cultural and practical barriers. Second step in kind of developing your programming is addressing, trying to find out how you can address the structural gender inequalities. And I'm sure most of you will be able to think about so many issues in terms of gender inequality. We can think, for instance, about who has control over economic assets, issues around access and ownership of land. So there are many more, but yeah, these are really important if you kind of want to bring this nexus on gender, climate, and security into practice. You need to really address those structural gender inequalities. And then thirdly, we really need to capitalize on existing networks, such as women's associations, indigenous groups, unions, cooperatives, other types of community-based organizations, NGOs, and support these organizations in terms of climate change adaptation capacity, conflict sensitivity, so that they have the capacity and also feel really empowered to lead on this nexus programming and to influence policymakers in this sense. So with this, I really wanted to explain how we can close the gender gap in climate change adaptation and peace building interventions. And like I said, it's, what I've just explained is not rocket science. It just really requires everybody, practitioner, policymakers, academics, to really take these steps very deliberately, and basically just act upon the knowledge that we have already. And with that's actually the end of my short intervention. I will just copy the full guidance notes here in the notes as well in the chat box for people to have easy access to it, and you can review it in your own time. But thank you for listening. Over to you again, Joanne.
Great, thank you, Jessica. That was very helpful and fascinating as well, and important to bring I think, a programmatic and practical experience to this, especially when drawing from multiple country contexts as you've had. So, or as you have brought in. So I think that's a very important contribution as well. So thank you. Now I'll be turning over to Dr. Obosede. I'm not sure if you can turn your camera on. Excellent, great. So I see your face, how fabulous. Thank you, welcome. And you will be speaking, I think your paper is Women's Agency in Conflict and Peacebuilding in Nigeria's Niger Delta region. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, the chair, presenters, and the general audience for the opportunity to present this paper in this conference. And as you have said, the focus is on the Women Agency in Conflict and Peacebuilding in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. And the paper focus on the role that women are playing in conflict, in the endemic conflict that is rampant in the Niger Delta, and how this impacts on their peace building capacity. Niger Delta is the location of the enormous oil resources that constitute the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. And why the Nigerian government, the oil resources is extracted by global corporations like Shell, Ajib, Mobiles, and others. But the extractive activities of these global multinational corporations are carried out without regard to the environment and lack of compliance with both global and national environmental regulation. As a result, this has led to massive environmental degradation that adversely affects the traditional livelihood of the people, which revolves around subsistence farming and fishing, as well as trading. And the plight of the people is complicated by the lack of developmental amenities, the failure of government to provide public goods, services for the people in a way to address some of the adverse impact. And also failure of government to comply the oil corporation to explore oil by adhering to national environmental practices. And at the same time, the inability of the oil company to actually ensure that they adhere to their corporate social responsibility and also adequately compensate the people for the adverse impact of oil exploration. And this have led to a lot of agitation, struggles by the people. And in the early 90s, this struggle was actually based on peaceful, non-violent protestation, which was championed then by the late environmentalist Ken Saro-Wiwa. But along the line, the response of the Nigerian government and the oil multinational has been coercive and repressive in a way that actually spoiled a violent struggle by the youth in the Niger Delta. So in this violent agitation, we have to explore the gender nature of the struggle by the people in a context in which women are the major victims of this. And looking at studies on the Niger Delta, we have focused more on the notion of women victimhood without looking at the capacity as agents in conflict, particularly the varied roles they have played in the conflict. So gender studies on the Niger Delta crisis has mostly also focused on the main centric aspect of the struggle, while the varied roles that women have played that demonstrate their agency in conflict are downplayed. Also in the context in which women are the major casualties, also in terms of the adverse impact of the extractive activities of women because of the patriarchal setting, where women right are undermined when they face a lot of marginalization in terms of access to resources, also in terms of access to land. This complicated the plight of women. So women are now increasingly involved in the struggle. But while women rose in the conflict initially as centered on peaceful protests and agitation for environmental state. But in the late 90s, when the agitation transformed to violent struggle, women too are playing key role. And it is important for us to look at the roles that women are playing as actors in the conflict and how this impacts on their peace building capacity. Also in the sense that most studies have considered that even when women play a role in conflict, this role actually is linked to the gender roles in terms of playing roles as domestic servants, cooks for the armed actors. But the reality is that women are playing more roles that transcend their traditional gender roles. And in the Niger Delta, my research has shown that women play roles.
Hopefully that's just a short glitch. Hopefully I'm sure others are experiencing it too. It's not just me. Yes, okay. We'll just wait for a little bit. Teresa, shall we try to essentially stop the camera? Maybe we can hear her audio, but maybe the video is too much. Whoops. I think we may have lost her. All right, so we'll pause there on her presentation. We're just getting into the heart of it, unfortunately, but we did hear a good part of it. Hopefully she can reconnect. So while we wait for Abosede to join us, I suggest we go on to Marissa. Your topic today is essentially gender inclusive multi-track diplomacy as environmental peace building. And I think your paper is called Bridging the Gap, or your presentation is. So over to you. And if it could be that Abosede joins, we'll let you finish your presentation, and then maybe we'll go back to her after, instead of interrupting your presentation as well.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. So let me see if I can.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Joanna, for your initial introduction and for agreeing to chair this panel. It is a real privilege for me to be part of this panel and be in conversation with you, with my fellow panelists, and with everybody in the audience. Thank you for joining us. All right, let me get started. Let me see if this works. Yes, it does. Right. It is widely acknowledged that a balanced gender representation in peace processes results in agreements that are more durable and less likely to relapse into conflict. And we have plenty of empirical evidence demonstrating this point. Now, the increasing participation of women in grassroots and community level environmental peace building is also widely recognized as a positive development. It is critical to ensure that women from different backgrounds are able to participate in peace building negotiations. They also need to contribute to the design, not just implementation, of environmental governance initiatives on an equal footing with their male counterparts. Track 1 diplomacy conducted inside official government channels remains, however, male-dominated, as you, Joanne, noted in your initial introduction. Women's voices are thus sidelined, their human capital not applied to its full potential. Effective multi-track environmental diplomacy requires that we expand our conception of who the relevant decision makers are, and that we promote the meaningful participation of all significant stakeholders, including women. Ensuring a better gender balance in environmental diplomacy creates opportunities to leverage women's differential knowledge, diverse perspectives and experiences, including existing coping capacities and sources of resilience. This helps identify a broader set of solutions to environmental peacebuilding challenges by providing a more holistic understanding of local issues as they relate to regional and global priorities. Women's participation in environmental diplomacy is, however, not without risks, as women are often the targets of violence. When women environmental peace builders can safely and meaningfully contribute to inclusive diplomacy processes, interstate relations between countries sharing environmental resources are improved, and human security threats are mitigated. An illustrative example of this approach is a set of rehabilitation initiatives for female war survivors in South Sudan, collectively known as the Beam of Hope Project. The women in this program are being trained in peaceful conflict resolution strategies. They're also receiving counseling, training, and assistance with various livelihood schemes. These involve cooperative management of animals, land, and riparian resources. Through these activities, women are engaging in locally led peace building, participating in conservation efforts, and contributing to the food security of the community. Furthermore, several members of this program, including myself, participated in a joint peace committee, joint peace committee and traditional leaders conference organized by a South Sudanese peace building NGO called Assistance Mission for Africa and their partners in early September 2018. This conference was marked by the active participation of women, many of them members of various local women's peace committees. A formal peace agreement was signed on September 12, 2018, putting an official end to the South Sudanese civil war. Female civil society leaders acted as official observers in this peace process. Women comprised 25% of the delegates, while one woman served as a mediator. These women have demanded a broadening of the political agenda to include protection, education, health, and attention to environmental issues, especially as they impact livelihood provision. It is worth noting that although certainly not all, political violence abated in South Sudan after the signing of the peace agreement, high levels of violence against women have persisted. Women activists are often specifically targeted, confronting deeply ingrained cultural and social norms dictating a subordinate and mostly silent role for females may place women environmental peace builders in a difficult and even dangerous position. As other studies of conflict-affected females have also noted, resilience in the context of war often carries a high price. The international environmental peace building community must address the unequal power dynamics inherent in the aid sector. These dynamics play an important role in shaping relationships between international and local organizations, as well as among female and male members of organizations and communities. Examples of successful gender-inclusive multi-track diplomacy illustrate that opportunities and challenges of supporting women's leadership in deeply patriarchal conflict-affected countries, which, like South Sudan, are undergoing major environmental and socio-political changes. Often helping champion dialogue over dispute, women's leadership in environmental diplomacy has become even more critical given current challenges. We must incorporate gender-inclusive, multi-track environmental diplomacy efforts, acknowledging the gender web of interconnected activities, institutions, individuals of all genders, and communities that collaborate towards the common goal of a more peaceful and environmentally resilient world. We must elevate the participation of women environmental diplomats and ensure that gender issues are an intrinsic component of the peacebuilding agenda. Women environmental peace builders require tailored support and protection to ensure their safety, foster their ability to participate in environmental diplomacy discussion, and exercise their rights. To facilitate these objectives, we must incorporate gender disaggregated data and analysis and targeted policies and programs backed by sufficient funds in order to better address the impacts of conflict, environmental crises, and displacement on the lives of the affected women and girls, men and boys. Resulting findings on gender differentiated contributions can help policymakers, development practitioners, and peace builders mitigate the risks of environmental insecurity and promote resilient, inclusive, and peaceful societies. In turn, empowering local women will enable conflict-affected and environmentally fragile countries like South Sudan to strengthen its environmental, economic, and political structures and institutions. And thank you.
That was great, Marissa. Thank you. And that's an excellent complement as well to what's been presented previously, where we started, I think, with, again, this questioning of whether a focus on local is too constraining, and then subsequent presentation about, pragmatic approaches and programming, as well as, how to link, local to local authorities, and now local to, I think, state level engagement for peace building, for real meaningful structural change. So I think we're talking about multiple levels here, which are quite fascinating, as well as levels of duality so far around, vulnerability and agency that are coming across to, I think, in various presentations. And ultimately, what we're trying to achieve or we're supporting is structural change, and where to find it and how to enable it. So luckily, Abosede has rejoined us. So I think the last thing that Abosede was speaking to that I heard was about how women in the Niger Delta were transcending traditional gender roles. That's where I think you kind of cut off. So if you can pick up from there, that would be excellent. We were waiting with bated breath, so I'm really glad you've rejoined us. And if you have problems with your connection, you may want to not use a video if it helps. We'll listen attentively, whatever works for you.
So thank you very much. I apologize for the disruption. I have very unstable network. So I mentioned that women are playing varied roles that transcend their traditional gender roles, and women are playing roles as spies to transport weapons, and at the same time they are playing role as spiritualists, because they believe that women have the capacity to spiritually fortify the militant. And at the same time, women are actively involved in combat. The perspectives combatant conflict between the various militant groups. So this varied role women play transcend their traditional gender role. And it's also important to probe the motive behind the women involvement in this conflict. And women are now playing an active role. And we need to understand how the power relation between the Nigerian government, the officials, the oil multinationals, and the local actors, the few local actors that are benefiting the white majority, particularly behind the women are marginalized and oppressed. So this has created a situation in which women are seeking means to survive, whether by fair or foul means. And this actually have led to a climate of insecurity. And this also exacerbates the environmental degradation of the environment, because some of the activities, criminal activities involved beyond kidnapping, sea piracy, there is artisanal oil refining, which is very rampant in the oil community. And there have been evidence to show that women are also actively involved as buyers of these illegal oil after the tamper with pipelines. And this has been a major source of environmental degradation. And the fact that even though government granted amnesty to the armed actors involving state pardon and a DDR process, women are still marginalized despite the evidence that women have played active role in the struggle. So as a result, women are motivated to become actors because of the lack of empowerment and inability to find other means, viable means survival. And as a result, this impacts on their capacity as peace building or peace builders. Because of the fact that they are not empowered, they are now shifting to criminalities in a way that actually expose them to a life of crime. So the case of the Niger Delta demonstrates how women marginalization empowerment has impacted adversely on their capacity as peace builder. In the context in which women gender discourses focus the way as place women in the as peaceful, women as caregiver, nurturer. But we have to look at how women's situation and her circumstances, women everyday realities in terms of their subjugation, their oppression, marginalization are leading to women increasing involvement in armed struggle and playing diverse roles that undermine their capacity to play a role in peace building. So in conclusion, we need to understand that women are critical agents and they have both capacity as actors in conflict as well as actors in peace building. And when women continue to face marginalization, it leads to a situation in which they seek means to survive in a way that undermine the effort to build peace. And it also shapes sustain the armed struggle because women contribution support to these armed actors have continued to shape the dynamics of the armed struggle in a way that exacerbates the violence and lead to a cycle of violence and criminality. So thank you for your kind attention.
That was excellent. Thank you, Abusade. And it was an excellent way to wrap up the presentations because it almost ties back to the first questions that were raised and problematized around a simplistic notion potentially of women as either victims or enablers of peace and nothing in between, whereas you've very clearly provided a fascinating case where women are agitators, like you said, they use spirituality to play a role that may be destabilizing or to reinforce troops, active in combat, and spoilers of peace, because it's in their interest to do so, and because they're also trying to, secure economic as well as political space and agency. So it's very fascinating, and I think it's an excellent way to round off at least the presentations, because it brings us back to the beginning. So this is the time. We have about 30 minutes left where we open up for questions from the audience. I see we have about 50 participants, so I'm sure you're brimming with questions, and I hope you will post them in the chat. There was a question from Molly, who actually Molly, as well as I think, I didn't catch her name, Molly and her colleague, who was also the project manager in Colombia, specifically in the joint program that Caitlin and Maria were talking about. And I think they were drawing attention to the fact that they had to work very closely with local authorities, or which may kind of expand kind of our understanding of local. But Molly was asking specifically about, there's a practical aspect to having this narrow focus, or starting with this narrow focus. So it goes back a bit to maybe the pragmatic approach to gain some wins. But the question is, do you think local level engagement can provide an opportunity to drive structural change? I mean, all of these examples we're raising are all about efforts to drive structural change, or the limits of the power to do that in the way we frame and design our interventions or analysis. So do you think local level engagement can provide an opportunity to drive change? And then they ask for specific recommendations for the project.
I don't know who wants to start. Caitlin, do you want to start?
Sure, unless you want to start. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for these questions. And I think the first thing we would point out is that we're not trying to specifically pick on the UN as such, right? Or the UNEP or this joint program. We're using this as an illustrative example. I mean, I think from my perspective, local level initiatives can do things. It's not that they don't do things, but in terms of their ability to affect the structures that are most responsible for climate catastrophe and militarization, we should not expect women to be the ones to affect these broader structural changes. These broader structural responsibilities I mean, I don't want to speak for Maria, but these broader structural responsibilities for me are about the role of the global north and our militaries driving mineral extraction and militarization and other forms of extraction. So for me, in that sense, if those are the structures that are fundamentally responsible for climate catastrophe and global militarization, then it's not that local women in Sudan or Colombia shouldn't be engaged in natural resource management in their local context, but rather we should not expect them to be responsible to have any effect on the broader global structure inequalities that got them at least partially into the situation that they're in. I'm not giving you any practical examples. I think I would just push on the fact that we need to name and be conscious of where does responsibility for this lie, and not leave kind of global silences in how we at least how we frame these agendas. Okay, sorry, Maria, go ahead.
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, I think that Caitlin explained very well what was behind our ideas for the project, or the way that we understand that those linkages and those local initiatives are not enough. But what I wanted also to point out to the fact that whereas these local initiatives can improve certain lives, they have also proven to be, and there's a lot of research behind this that shows how including or adding some women in decision-making structures for natural resource management, for local peace building, etc., sometimes has had, without changing anything else, has had retaliation effects. And so sometimes they have even been counterproductive. And then when we're talking about pragmatism, I guess that it depends on what your main role is. If your main goal is to ensure that certain women have access to a decision-making table, then all right, but you are not going to solve climate change, migration due to climate change, food insecurity, unequal access to land and natural resource management by training women to negotiate and to be sitting at the negotiation table.
I see hands up from Jessica and Marissa, who I think want to jump in to comment. Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Molly, I'm sorry, I don't know the details of the project. I've come across it. It sounds very fascinating, and also what I've just been hearing from Kathleen and Maria. So I'm not able to talk specifically to that project, just a bit more basically on our own experience at International Alert, is that yes, the easy way of intervening in this space is at kind of the local horizontal level. But I really also think and see in our work that what if you do that horizontal level very well, if you build those capacities, you empower the different groups, and you kind of link that to kind of more vertical kind of activities by bringing in subnational or national level kind of influencing work. And you facilitate kind of the networks and the relationships that these groups can build, women's groups or other minority groups. You can really kind of also leverage what you're trying to do at the horizontal level at a more vertical level as well. So I mean, there's no best example in those ways. I mean, it's really context specific, but I think especially if you have the space in your program of a longer term program, I think you cannot miss on that opportunity to kind of build at a higher level. Yeah, it doesn't reach kind of the issues that Kathleen is pointing at in terms of kind of the extractive sector, militarization. I think that's even a discussion at a whole different level. But yeah, so those are kind of my reflections to that question. Thank you.
Great, and we'll go to Marissa, but I'd also, after Marissa, like to hear from Opusere, because the notion of the local actually influencing multinational oil companies in particular through their agitations and their role, I find fascinating, connecting those two. So I'd like to come back to that after, because it does seem they're powerful extractive companies. It doesn't actually come any more powerful than the oil industry. So Marissa, over to you.
Yeah, well, my remarks are also not specifically related to this UN project, although I am familiar with it. I've worked extensively in Colombia and in South Sudan, but not in Sudan. Now, my paper, the title of my paper was Bridging the Gap, precisely because I was grappling with this idea of the relationship between grassroots efforts and high-level diplomacy, high-level discussions. And what I found out, both in the case of South Sudan and in other countries in which I've worked, is that there is often a disconnection between these two levels. On the one hand, high-level discussions may focus on issues that are of limited significance to those whose lives take place at a primarily community level structure. And on the other hand, the women who participate at the grassroots level, and that tends to be the majority of them, their projects are very specific, very localized, very rich in contextual information, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to influence what's going on at a high level. And so I think that what's missing is this middle ground. Women are participating especially at the grassroots level, to a lesser extent in high-level diplomacy, but there's a disconnection between those two levels. And something else that is often common is the fact that the women who participate in high-level discussions are themselves not particularly representative of the majority of the female population of that country, and that sometimes in an effort to demonstrate that they belong in this very male-dominated kind of environment, they emphasize masculine kinds of priorities and don't necessarily represent the rest of the female population in the country. And so I think that efforts are being made and progress is being made. And I've identified a number of examples in which there's been a connection, like the one that I discussed in my presentation. The women in the Beam of Hope, some of them participated in the higher level kinds of discussions, but that is typically not the case. So that's something that requires more focused attention.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to come back to this issue of representation. And there's a question as well linked to identity in the chat box I want to come back to. But again, Obosede, can you speak to, you talked about, transcending traditional gender roles, but does that allow women to transcend or go from local to national or influencing, powers like the oil sector in the case of Nigeria?
Very much. The reality in the Niger Delta case is that women at the grassroots are the people that are actually facing the most forms of marginalization, because generally the people in the region, both looking at the gender nature of the situation there, is that both men and women are affected. But women challenges the situation is complicated because of the patriarchal system in which women are seen as subordinated to men, and women have limited rights, socioeconomic rights, and women also are not part of the decision making. They hardly have rights within the socio-political system. Even when they have women leaders, these people are selected by the local traditional chiefs and other major actors that control who get what and how, access to the limited oil resources coming in. So because of this cultural constraints, women's situation are very, very, very plight, are very pathetic. And as a result, now they have to look for a way to survive, particularly in contexts in which they have children. And the situation in the Niger Delta is many of these men in the household, they marry many wives, and they leave the care of the children, everything to the wife, to the women. And also, women do not have a right to ownership of land. They only have access to it. And this constraint undermine their capacity to even get access to even the little compensation coming from the oil multinational. And even when women support men in their agitation, in the struggle, at the end of the day, it is the men that decide who get what. And little of this even hardly come to the women. So this creates a situation in which women now are seeking enemies to survive. And this survival includes when the armed actors are capitalizing on women's situation to use women to as strategies in their armed struggle in a way that exacerbates the violence. And so this highlights the importance of gender inclusive approach to tackling the conflict in the region and towards peace.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Maybe it'll come back. All right, so we'll go to the next question, and I'm hoping Abusede will join us momentarily again. There's another question, and it's directed actually at Jessica, but I think everybody will probably want to speak to it in some form. And it's linked to the issue of identity. So you mentioned in your presentation, Jessica, you referred to multiple identities: gender, generation, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. But if the principles are rooted or hark back to gender only, I guess the question is around, an intersectional approach, or genders plural, not just men and women. So we just don't have that dichotomy. So that issue of, how do we be more inclusive as well and not be limiting when talking about gender? And then that, of course, too, I think links to the representation issue. Who's speaking for women? Who are women? And who's speaking for whom, that Marissa alluded to. So Jessica, I don't know if you have any responses to that, or if anybody else wants to jump in after.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And I try to be very kind of deliberate in my presentation to have a very broad understanding of gender. And not just talk about men and women, because here Mirka is referring to indigenous peoples, and that is in many places a minority group. But even if you look at the group of indigenous populations, there are so many people categories in that group, and I think it really comes down to, working for a peacebuilding organization, it really comes down to what I said, that really understanding kind of their intersectionality, doing your analysis very well, and kind of looking at it from a power analysis. because that's when you will really see where the power lies, which groups have the power, which groups don't have the power, or all the categories in between. And I think that's, it's so easy to, or we're kind of always, if you look from a programming background, we're always kind of pushed to kind of quickly come up with our programs, our actions, our activities. But if you do it that way, you kind of just, you're not able to really understand where the opportunities lie in terms of kind of addressing power relationships, which is really key if you do peace building work. Similarly, if you if there's that intersection with climate change and environmental issues. So yeah, that's kind of how we try to go around our work with gender and peace building. And it's basically learning by doing. I will repeat what I just said. I mean, it's so context specific, and you really kind of need to build up your understanding of the context that you're working in. And even then, it changes. It changes very quickly. So it's continuous work to really make sure that you kind of understand and work with those groups and individuals that need it the most to elevate their voices and their experiences.
Great. Caitlin, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think I would just, in terms of this question of putting power at the center of analyses, I think this is also what Maria and I were pushing for, but also to think more broadly beyond the interpersonal relations that structure power, but how, for instance, and Marissa, you alluded to this as well in your presentation, how are the discourses of international organizations also gendered? And what kinds of power relations are implicit in how we in international interventions frame particular things as being more important or less important? What kinds of things do we treat as security issues, and what are the implications of that? What kinds of things get funding, and then how do we evaluate the success or non-success of different funding instruments? All of these things are also imbued with power relations, and from a feminist perspective, I would say all of these things are also gendered in their power relations in terms of what gets privileged and how it gets privileged. So I think I would absolutely build on what Jessica has said by pushing us, I say us collectively, even though I have the privilege of being an academic and I don't often have to think about the practical, but to push us to think about, well, how are their power relations implicit in all levels of institutions beyond just the interpersonal relations in contexts where interventions are being staged.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Marissa.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo everything that both Jessica and Kathleen have said. And I think that we need to keep in mind that power relations are an intrinsic feature of the human condition. And so they are relevant in any kind of context in which human beings are involved. So they apply to the power relations between researchers and the target community, those working at high level, high level kind of diplomacy discussions, grassroots level organizations, both vertically and horizontally. So that's kind of a given that is not always receiving as much attention. But going back to the idea of the focus on gender, I think that I've noticed an increasing reference to intersectional notions of gender, which I applaud. I don't think that we always unpack what that actually means on the ground. And I think that part of the problem is that what it means is very context specific. Okay, and so on the one hand, we have gender, which is a universal variable. And I frequently mention this: gender and generation, not necessarily age in a chronological sense, but gender and generation are universal variables. In every single society, differences are made based on gender understandings and generational understandings. And then, depending on the characteristics of that community, there are other variables that may be just as important, including ethnic membership, religious affiliation, displacement, status, and so forth and so on. But all of those other variables may or may not. I mean, a variable is something that varies. If it doesn't vary, it's not a variable. Okay, as simple as that. While gender is always a variable. And so again, gender and generation need to always be present in combination with whatever other variables happen to be meaningful in that particular context, recognizing that the combination of these different sources of social difference are going to influence the power relations between and among all of the various groups. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Marissa. And I saw Obosede applauding you there when you were talking about, the gender and generation being universal variables. And your hand is also up, Obosede, so over to you.
Very much. I agree with the issue about gender. We have to, content-specific analysis, looking at the specific contents in which situation of women from different contexts. But I think we also need to be careful about overgeneralization when we look at gender issues, because it's important to avoid homogenizing women, and with the notion that all women are facing the same plight and challenges. Important to us to look at heterogeneity in terms of categories of women and the situation of these categories, and also to look at how various women, the experience of women shape their situation in specific content. So it's important for us to look at how even women sometimes can actually victimize other women. And so the issue of heterogeneous approach to looking at women experience, everyday reality, will help us to actually bring out some of the dynamics of gender issues that we are researching on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just see I have a follow-up question, but I see a question in the chat that I want to privilege from Sophia Gajan or Gahan, a new gender and peacebuilding program assistant at the European Institute of Peace, is asking, while climate risks often incite violence, are there concrete examples of climate or environment-related pathways for peace and rethinking power structures? I am thinking of environmental degradation through war as a connecting factor for peace process, i.e. landmine deployment, for example. And she's looking to learn from you. So concrete examples of climate or environment-related pathways for peace and rethinking power structures. Although many of you have kind of spoken to this in some way throughout the panel. Is there anything else that you want to add, perhaps, in response to this? Okay, then I will come in with my question. It's not really a question. I guess I want to explore further this, local, national, global, multinational, connecting tissue that's running through all the conversation here. I guess, I'm an anthropologist by training, but I work for a nonprofit, an NGO, and some of the work that we've done essentially. The issue of like what was raised in terms of gender as this universal variable at the local level allows for consciousness raising about power in the first place. Is that not a precursor, that kind of consciousness raising locally, to look at your own community and your own life, to ask questions about power before you look at big power questions globally, whether it's the oil sector or the extractive sector or militarization? Does that reflection not, is it not intrinsically have to start with yourself and your community before you look global?
I don't want to, I've said a lot, so if someone else wants to go first, I totally have a thought about this, but I don't want to be the one to monopolize this.
Maria, do you have a response to that?
Okay, so I don't know if I have the response to that, of course. But well, I have a thought about that as well, and is that when we were talking about when we are talking about the local community, who is local and who is national, international, we're always thinking in terms of the local being out there and the international being us. But we are also a local somewhere in our, and of course, the interrogating the local gender power relations are going to open up possibilities for solutions for those power imbalances at home. But those power relationships at home are only a part of the power relationships that we export or that are taking place at the international level. So, for example, when you're talking about let me give you an example of, I don't know, a local village in Liberia where you have an international, a multinational extraction company, right, that extracts palm oil. And you're going to have there, of course, gender power imbalances in terms of who in the local community is able to decide and to negotiate with the extraction company, and who is not allowed to negotiate with those, who is allowed actually also a piece of land and who is not. But if you only see, or if you only solve the problem of the local patriarchal culture that makes women actually not allowed to inherit land or not allowed to negotiate with the concession company, and you do not look at the gender power imbalances as well, that look at how the international is supposed to be taking care of the local and is supposed to be teaching the local how to manage, how to govern in a good way natural resources, how to manage natural resources in a good way, then you're missing actually as well what are the biggest power imbalances there. So yes and no at the same time.
Marissa, do you want to jump in? You have your hand up.
Yes, I think that your question is absolutely fundamental, especially in the context of peace building, but not exclusively. And that I think it raises the issue of borders and the difference between local and what is not local, remembering that displacement is a frequent response to environmental change and conflict. Now, a while back, I wrote a paper which I titled Displaced Girlhood. Not displaced girls, but displaced girlhood, because a lot of the displacement I was discussing had more to do with cultural dislocation that may or may not have been related to the physical displacement of the young women involved. And so with respect to what you said about local understandings of gender being a fundamental component of people's self-identity and membership in the community, I think that these notions of gender, these notions of identity, which involve not just gender, like everything in culture, they are very fluid, and they tend to respond to changing environmental conditions. Environment, the way we understand it as an anthropologist, meaning not just natural environment, but everything that surrounds us. So part of the work that I've done with South Sudanese survivors has taken place in refugee camps and settlements in other countries, primarily across the border in Uganda. And that one thing I noticed is that the way power dynamics manifest themselves between people working in peace-building organizations in refugee settlements, which are managed by the international community, tend to be very different from the way those relationships take place when these people cross the border back into South Sudan. Okay? In the settlements, the relationships tend to be more egalitarian, actually, and people speak the language of the international community in a way. Many of the peace-building organizations that I was working with had approximately the same number of females as they have as males, and women were much more active in speaking out than they themselves recognize they would be able to be openly and without worrying about potential negative consequences when they went back to South Sudan. So they often mention, I'm not sure how we would be able to translate these kind of interactions and these kinds of actions when we go back. So I think that that's something that we need to pay attention to. And they don't necessarily speak in the language of anthropology or but they were aware this would be risky when we go back. My own family would not allow me to engage in these kinds of activities, or many of them were youth-led organizations. Say, well, I'm not able to identify myself as a youth working for peace building. I would put myself at risk. And so it's, I thought it was extremely interesting to see how people navigated and negotiated their multiple changing identities to better reflect the local conditions and their ability to be effective and remain safe. So,
Yes.
so yeah, all of these things need to be taken into consideration because they very much affect people's, the way people are being impacted and their ability to contribute.
Yeah, excellent points, excellent points. And of course, underscoring this fluidity, right? Just absolutely central and important to all of this. Unfortunately, we only have 1 minute left, so I don't want to go over time. So I think I'm just going to have to end it there, just as we're really getting started, unless somebody has one burning comment to make that will last 30 seconds.
Can I try the academic challenge of a 30-second comment?
Go for it. I want to see this. Okay.
Okay. So gendered relations are contextual, but they are not a closed loop. And the politics of the household are intrinsically related to international gendered politics of the global economy or international institutions.
Well said.
Well said.
That's an excellent summary. So thank you very much, everybody, for a very rich exchange. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I wish we could keep talking because I feel like we're just getting started. But I appreciate, the exchange and the richness, and everybody was on time, and this was fabulous. Thank you. I hope I see you again soon, hopefully in person somewhere, but even virtually would be great. So thank you for all your efforts and for this great thinking.
Thank you for leading us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.